retirement of certain words when it comes to the apostolic scriptures. I think these words need to be retired because they have continually moved the people of God away from the truth of His Word. And these words are popular and familiar, but they are inaccurate for defining for us what the biblical text is actually saying. Here's the first word that needs to go. We're talking about the apostolic scriptures. Church. The word church needs to go. It needs mandatory retirement. There was no such thing in the first century as a church. Because when most people think about a church, they think either one of two things. Either a building, for instance, you come to Peninsula Baptist Church, you come to this place, and it's called, the building is called a church. Or people tend to think of a denomination. They say, I attend the Lutheran church, or I go to the Baptist church. So either a denomination or a place. In the Greek text of the apostolic scripture, all we had was the word ecclesia, which could refer to a gathered group of people of multiple ethnicities, either Jews or Gentiles. It had nothing to do with any denomination or with any particular building. If we were going to talk about a particular place, we might have said the word synagogue and talked about the synagogue of a particular town. So when you go to such and such a place, go to the synagogue of that particular place. But there was no such thing as a church. And what happens is, we translate the word ecclesia, church, and we then anachronistically backload all that we think about churches into that word. Second word that needs to be retired. Ought to have mandatory retirement. Christians. There were no such thing as Christians in the apostolic scriptures. There were Christ believers. There were those who believed in the Christ. In fact, the Apostle Paul never says the word Christian in any of his writings. In the book of Acts, we have twice the word Christanoi, plural, and one time in another book of the apostolic text later on. 3 times total do we have the plural, Christanoi, which is simply meant Christ believers. It had nothing to do with what we think of today when you hear Christian or Christianity. It had nothing whatsoever to do with that. It just simply meant Jewish Christ believers, Gentile Christ believers. And by the way, that's another word that's a little bit difficult because as soon as we hear the word Christ, many of my Gentile brothers think that Christ was his last name. So they hear, their name is Bob Smith, and they go, okay, Jesus Christ. We'll get to Jesus in just a moment. It should be Yeshua. The text says, and you shall call his name Yeshua, for he will Yeshua. You should call him salvation, for he will save his people from their sins. So now we're saying Jesus, and that moves us away from the idea that his name means salvation. And then people hear Christ, and they don't understand that the word Christ comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which is then put into Greek as Messiah. Actually, Messiah is an English transliteration of Mashiach. And now, Mashiach means anointed, Messiah means anointed, and Christos means anointed. So now we say Jesus Christ instead of Yeshua the Messiah. Listen how different this is. Listen to this saying. Jewish Christ believers and Gentile Christ believers gathered in the synagogue to worship Yeshua HaMashiach. How different does that sound as saying people went to church to worship Jesus Christ? It sounds incredibly different. And language moves us away from the truth. We take this language and we move ourselves away from what the biblical text actually says, and we divest it of its Jewish roots and its Hebraic roots. I've had occasion the last few weeks to go back and listen to a number of the what are called apostolic fathers. Actually, church fathers. They're called church fathers. And almost to an individual, the church fathers are anti-Semitic and anti-Torah, coming from the Gentile strain. So I know that we're taking language from them and thoughts from them, and then we have this language of English that moves us again away from what the biblical text says. It's no wonder we are where we are 2,000 years later.
But then again, the Jews threw out the Christ believers out of the synagogue because they didn't agree with them. Because these Christ people will not accept the Jewish customs.
There's some, yes, very much some truth to that.
So those are anger.
I'll give you an example of this. We have a classic example of this. We were discussing this particular text this past week. I was at a Bible study, and the gentleman who was facilitating the study stands up and he says, Acts chapter 9, we have Paul's conversion. Paul's conversion to Christianity. What's the problem with that? There's no such thing as Christianity. You can't have something, you can't have Paul converting to something that never existed yet. It didn't even exist yet. So I made the statement, I said, hold on, let me ask you this. I said, is Paul a Yahweh believer already? And they went, whoa. I said, look at what he's doing. This is a man who has gone to the chief priest. He's gone to the chief priest to get letters so that he can toss out of the synagogue Jewish and Gentile Christ believers, because he believes that they are propagating a heresy. They're saying that a man was God, and this man, we know, died. And they're claiming he resurrected, but not really sure. We know he died for sure. And they're claiming, though, that this man was God. So we need to get rid of these people, because they're a problem. And they're going to become a greater problem. Yeah, they become too popular. So Paul, when he's confronted, says, Lord. He recognizes this voice. And he's gone to the chief priest so he can go to the synagogue. This is not a man who didn't believe in Yahweh. He was already a Yahweh believer. And this for my friends, for my Gentile friends, absolutely, I could see their minds going. They assumed that Paul was a pagan who then converted to Christianity. And I said, no, Paul was a Yahweh believer who came to the realization that Yeshua was the Mashiach. And they just went, what do we do with that? They had no paradigm for that.
Several times in the book of Acts, Paul said he was a Pharisee.
Yes.
Not a pagan.
Right. And he says, I am a Pharisee. And towards the end of his life, he's saying, I am a Pharisee. And here again, you look at a dictionary. You look at the word Pharisee, and the first definition that will come up will be this: somebody who is a hypocrite. It's now synonymous in modern terminology with a hypocrite. Never mind the fact that we had very good Pharisees, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, Paul. So, were all Pharisees hypocritical?
No.
No. Were all Pharisees bad?
No.
No. There's a spectrum.
I do know, I don't remember the word
But hypocrite derives from, was basically the word used for actor.
Yes,
So-
because if you saw the Greek plays, you would have the masks.
What did she say?
She said that the word hypokrites, it's the word hypocrite, is the idea of mask. Because in the Greek plays, you would have, you guys have seen the sad mask and the happy mask they put side by side?
Yeah.
Okay, so actors would put up in front of their face on a stick a mask. Okay? So you're playing a role. Behind the mask is another face. So you can take this one away and put one in front of it. You're playing a role. But behind that role is another face. So that's where the root of this comes from. So now when people hear the word Pharisee, they don't even take it back to the word parushim, which means a separated one. And I dare say, had most of us been living in the first century, we would have worked with and been around and studied under and studied with and congregated with Pharisees. Josephus says as much. The Pharisees were extremely popular with the populace. They were loved by the populace. They believed in resurrection. They believed in angels. They believed that the prophets were also the scriptures. So we would have resonated with the Pharisees very much so. Now, were there problem Pharisees? To be sure. But were every one of them a problem? No. We read in our text today, this one who invites Yeshua to his house. And by the way, he never says anything negative to Yeshua, nor does anybody at the house. They're just all thinking. But Yeshua knows their thoughts. Which, by the way, tells us who he is. Because if you look at the Hebrew Scriptures, the only one in the Hebrew Scriptures that can know the thoughts of a person is Yahweh. And yet Yeshua's sitting there saying, he's looking at Simon and he says, I know your thoughts. And he's looking at the group and he says, I know what they're thinking. So there's some words that if we don't retire them, if we keep looking at the apostolic scriptures and saying Christians, church, Jesus, if we keep using that terminology, we move people away from what the text actually says. Yeah.
My understanding about the origin of the word church was it's from a Norse, a German type of word meaning circle, which was derived from the worship of a goddess, Circe, who exerted control over the people.
I've heard some
And that King James ordered it to be put into the Bible because it would be the Church of England which would control England. And that was the derivation of the word.
Yeah, there's some etymologies of the word that are interesting. So the bottom line is that it's the Greek word ekklesia, which simply just meant a gathering of people. And it had nothing to do with a building or with a denomination. But as soon as we hear church today, and as soon as you hear Christians, in fact, Acts 9 says, initially they were called people of the way.
Yeah.
They were called the way. Why? Because if you go back to Hebrew Scriptures, you look at the Psalms and the Proverbs, and it says there are two paths, there are two ways. There's the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked. So the wisdom literature spoke of this being on the right path. Make sure you're on the right path. So you see that all the way of the Lord, the way of the righteous. So they were just called the way, which was probably shorthand for the way of the Lord or the way of the righteous. In fact, Qumran, he was known as the teacher of righteousness. So you would follow the path of righteousness with the teacher of righteousness. Yeah.
Another thing in the translation issues, whenever you see church, it dealt with Christians, but you saw the word synagogue, which came from the same word, either Jews or of Satan. And it was funny how they took the same word to show the church in something positive, but anything with Satan or the Jews as negative. That's part of the anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and not only that, but the first Christanoi in Acts are actually Jewish Christ believers.
Yes.
So that gets lost. All right, segue. Because preparing for some stuff down the road. What is for the Apostle Paul? What is for the Apostle Paul his most favored term? What is from the Apostle Paul? He uses it well over 80 times in his
Grace and
epistles.
peace.
Huh?
Grace and peace.
Well, grace and peace is his salutation. That's the salutation he puts either on the front or on the end. But what is his big theological statement that he repeats over and over again?
Lawlessness?
Huh?
Lawlessness.
No, not as much as this one I'm thinking. Yes.
Is it when he says Paul is servant of in his intro?
No.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Kingdom of God.
No, he doesn't actually. He doesn't get into that as much as the Gospels do, which are a little bit later. Yes.
He always said he was a sinner, he's the worst sinner.
Yeah, he says that a couple times, but that's only a couple times. There's a phrase that he uses well over 70 plus times.
Pharisee, he identifies himself as either a Benjamite or Pharisee.
Yeah, that he does a couple times. One in Philippians.
Okay.
Go with me to Romans chapter 8. You need to know this phrase. Romans chapter 8. This is the phrase that Paul uses. There's a short form of it and a long form of it. Look at verse 1 of Romans chapter 8. Now listen to this. There is therefore no condemnation to those who are
In Christ.
Messiah Yeshua. There's the phrase. In Messiah Yeshua. The short form would be just in Messiah. That is his pivotal phrase throughout his books. You are in Messiah. And that phraseology is packed. For Paul, he's going to spend his books unpacking that phrase. What does it mean that you and I are in Messiah? In the same book of Romans, I'll show you again. Look at Romans chapter 8, verse 37. Yet in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels nor principalities nor powers, nor things present nor things to come, nor height nor depth nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Messiah Yeshua, our Lord. Yeah, Christ Jesus, that's how. But Messiah Yeshua. It's in Messias. In Messias Jesus, or in Messiah Yeshua. That for Paul is the key phrase. That you and I, and everything we need, everything about our lives are wrapped up in Messiah. And I want to use the full phrase, in Messiah Yeshua. So that, hold on to that, because we're going to come back to that. And I want to try to unpack for you what Paul meant by that. Because I think he uses it 70 plus times throughout his epistles. So it's an extremely important phrase for him. He adds that phrase to everything. Puts that, at key places, you're in Messiah Yeshua. You're in Messiah Yeshua. Notice what Paul doesn't say, where you are. And by the way, he doesn't say that you are in Israel. He doesn't say, and by the way, he talks to Jews and says, those of you who are Jews are in Messiah Yeshua. And those of you who are Gentiles are in Messiah Yeshua. I'll show you places where he addresses both. Key is not being in Israel. The key is being in Messiah Yeshua.
So, for us who are Gentiles, maybe have some Hebraic roots in our genealogy somewhere, but we're trying to keep Torah. Many things we can't do unless we're in Israel. How do we put together for just practice in
that's a great
Yeshua?
question. And I think this is where Paul, I don't want to get into it now, but he understands that there is that Messiah Yeshua is the quintessential representative of all Israel. You are in Israel by being in Messiah. Because he is the sine qua non, he is the quintessential Israelite. And if you are in him, You are in Israel.
Then for those, like in our Torah reading this week, talk about there are 3 feasts where we must go to Jerusalem to participate, well, which is practically impossible, financially because of the distance and then cost. But how do we do that if we can do that just in Yeshua? I mean,
I'm saying, well, right now, obviously, we can't. Even if you could go to Jerusalem right now.
there's no proper temples.
There's no temple standing, there's no priesthood standing, so even if you could go there, theoretically, which you could, you still couldn't fulfill the commandments to go up to Jerusalem and do the things that the Torah commands. You could go to Jerusalem, but you couldn't go to the temple. You could go to the Temple Mount, but you wouldn't be able to, there's no temple standing there, nor a priesthood. So, but the point is that for Paul, Yeshua is the quintessential Israelite. He represents all Israel. He even represents the temple. He is the temple in motion. So if we understand everything that he is, then we are in him, and by being in him, we are in them. Because he was always in them. He was, go with me to Numbers real quick. Go with me to the book of Numbers. Chapter 22. It's the corporate versus the individual. The Yeshua as the corporate representative Numbers chapter 22. Okay, look at Numbers chapter, I would go to 23, excuse me, 23. This is one of the oracles of Balaam. You need to see this.
Which chapter are we in?
23.
Okay.
Numbers chapter 23. I'm going to show you the trajectory. Here's the trajectory of the scriptures. This is the big picture. Look at Numbers chapter 23, verse 22. It says, God brings them out of Egypt. He's talking about the people of Israel. God brings them out of Egypt. If you go over one chapter to chapter 24, look at verse 8. God brings him out of Egypt. First he brought them out, then he brought him out. Because he was in them. The he being Mashiach. Now go to Hosea chapter 11. Hosea chapter 11. The prophet. Look at Hosea chapter 11. This is the prophetic text. Look what he says. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now go to Matthew chapter 2. Birth narrative of Yeshua. Matthew chapter 2. And look at verse 15. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. And was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord through the prophet, Hosea 11. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now when Hosea is looking at out of Egypt I called my son, he's thinking about the nation of Israel. But Numbers is looking this direction and says, he brought them out. And then it says, he brought him out. And Hosea looks back and says, out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew looks back and says, looks at Hosea, who's looking at Numbers, and says, out of Egypt I brought my son. This is the corporate representing the individual representing the corporate. If they came out, he came out.
But early on, when these people went into Egypt, he went with them.
Yes.
He was with them all the time.
He was always with them all the time.
So he has to come out.
Yes.
Just like
He was in the seed. He was in the seed of this people. So when he brought them out, he brought him out. This is the corporate understanding of the one and the many. That the one can represent the many. And Yeshua is the quintessential Israelite. Therefore, he represents all Israel. If you're in Messiah, you're in Israel. Yes?
No.
Okay. All right, go to the notes, please. A lot of stuff in this text.
Let me ask you a question.
Certainly.
It's interesting, this woman that was washing them with her tears and her drying on their head. When we go into the temple, we have to be holy and cleansed. She was a sinner and she touched him. That's interesting.
I think that
Usually, he heals people and forgives them first, but in this case, it's just...
yeah, I think now listen to what I'm going to say here. Listen to what I'm going to say here. I think Yeshua was unclean.
Huh?
Oh,
What?
I think Yeshua was unclean. I don't think that being unclean is a sin.
Well, he was on the earth, so it would kind of make sense, wouldn't it?
And plus, God turned his face away from him when he was on the cross because of carrying the sins of everyone. So.
But let's go back. You can be unclean and there be no sin. Because uncleanness was a category, a status of your relationship to the temple. It had not to do with sin. Now, if you go to the temple and you don't accept the remedy before you go, then you have sinned. But as long as you take the remedy prescribed by the Torah, either a sacrifice or an immersion or a combination, and then the waiting period, but there was nothing wrong with being unclean. Women who gave birth to a child were unclean. But they're commanded, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. A woman who had a menstrual cycle was unclean. But that had nothing to do with her being a sinner. Yes.
Maybe there's another term that can be used besides unclean that would mean the same thing, like not being sanctified or not being, not just being read, not being prepared, possibly.
Well, no, I like unclean. Just because tameh is